Coffee here for HUSNG.com, and today I'm talking about the CoffeeSpins HUD. I'm just going to do a quick guide, talk you through all the stats, all the nifty little features, things like that. If you have purchased the HUD and you haven't yet gone through the quick install guide, please make sure to do that just to make sure you have it all properly installed. But otherwise, I'll start talking about the HUD. So first off, just before I dive into all the different stats, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the philosophy behind the CoffeeSpins HUD and sort of how it compares to the Coffee HUD for the original one for HUSNGs. When I originally helped design the Coffee HUD for HUSNG.com, I tried to take a philosophy of trying to give as much information as possible in as most usable as form. And in that way, make a HUD that was just way better than anything else that was at the time available. And two major things were a result of that. The first was that it was a big HUD with a lot of groups all on the table and almost no pop-ups. And the idea behind that is that our brain recognizes whenever we add a step before we can take in information, it's one more place where we can sort of fail. It's one more place where we're not able to sort of have it in our peripheral vision. It's one more thing that we can't glance at. And it's one more thing where, as poker players, we have enough going on at the tables that having to manage, which pop-ups we're clicking on which tables to look at which stats is just, quite a lot to ask for. And so as a response, I've always tried to use as few pop-ups as possible, put everything on the table so that it's all visible and useful to you directly. Now with the three-handed HUD, of course, there's a lot of design difficulties behind trying to fit all that information when you're trying to do it for two different people and trying to give as much information. And on top of that, three-handed has a bunch of different situations that you want to take into account. And so this HUD does feature a couple pop-ups, we'll discuss them, that are meant for very specific situations and that are only occasionally called for. And then on top of that, you can see that the CoffeeSpins HUD is sort of condensed. You can see the font. This is a special font. Again, the quick install guide talks about how to install it. We've sort of made it so that we can have as many statistics as densely as possible while having everything well organized and labeled. And so the other sort of side of things is that not only does the information have to be sort of accessible and visible, my belief is that the information should also be as directly useful as possible. It should give as clean information as possible. What I mean by that is that a lot of common statistics are actually not real statistics for a specific situation, but instead are a few different statistics averaged together based on how often they happened. Just to give you an example to make it really clear, there's a common stat used called limp fold. And what limp fold is, it's how often the player limped and then folded to an ISO. Now, the problem is that when you're playing short stacked, it turns out that people use a combination of non-all-in ISOs and ISO shoves. And everyone has very different frequencies versus both of those for folding. Players are going to fold a lot more to shoves than they are to non-all-in ISOs. And if you have a limp fold stat that has it all in one place, the issue you start getting is that your statistic doesn't really give you any clear information. It's not clean information because it's two different situations put together. The stat starts depending almost more on your own frequency of actions, how often you ISO'd non-all-in versus ISO shoved, then it even depends on what his actual fold frequencies are for those two actions. And so when you look down your cards and you're trying to decide whether to ISO and you look at a total limp fold frequency, it tells you very little, unless you've been really paying attention to your own game, how often you've been ISOing. But at that point, you've sort of been, you could have just been keeping track of it on paper. The whole point of a HUD is to keep track of it for you. So that's a really nice example. But obviously, this idea percolates throughout. The whole idea of effective stack based groupings is the same thing. People play very differently deep stacked and shallow stacked, and so you don't want your statistics depending on how often you play deep versus shallow versus that opponent. And you want to have each of those situations separate. And again, for three-handed play, this presented a pretty unique challenge because there's so many different situations. And the filtering and the statistics end up being quite complicated for, really drilling down into the basics of the situation, figuring out who's in the hand, what the sizes are, etc. So, all right, so let's go ahead and dive into the HUD and start seeing theory and practice and see how the HUD ends up looking in terms of statistics. So I'm just going to start from the bottom. So this whole section at the bottom that I have separated, and this is just one way to organize it. In PT4, there's tons of room to organize. Obviously, on a real table, on PokerStars or any other client, there's a little bit less room. Just look at some of the screenshots that are on the HUSNG.com website for good ideas on how to organize it for your table. But in any case, so these bottom groupings with the gray color coding here and the black color coding here are specifically for three-way situations that involve the button. So these remove all small blind versus big blind play when the button open folded. That's all over here. And so that's the one, that's already one major separation that has to be in a three-handed HUD to get accurate details, is you don't want hands that the big blind played versus a small blind to be interfering with hands that the big blind played versus the button. And so pre-flop, this is all pretty easy. We've got just the button stats. We do have a big raise size. So this is how often they've sort of 3x'd or other big sizes like that. We have their VPIP, that's just how often they played a hand rather than open folding. We have their min raise frequency. We have their fold to non-all on 3-bet, fold to 3-bet shove. We have their open shove, limp frequency, limp fold to non-all in and to all in as needed. And then we have it for three different stack groups, 16 to 25, 9 to 16, 0 to 9. And then continuing down, we have the sort of corresponding small blind and big blind situations. This is all versus the button. So the first section is small blind versus the button. So this is how often the small blind folded to a big button open. This is how often the small blind folded to a min raise. This is how often the small blind 3-bet non-all in, 3-bet shoved. This is their VPIP versus a limp. So it's 1 minus the fold frequency versus a limp. This is how often they limped along. And then this is how often they ISO'd, non-all in and all in. And then lastly, of course, the big blind column, we have fold to a big sizing from the button, fold versus min raise, fold versus non-all in 3-bet, fold versus 3-bet shove. And this is where, again, we've separated two situations. So I said this is just fold versus min raise and 3-bet. This is specifically when the small blind has folded. So this is heads up. Because obviously these numbers are going to be different, and we can see these are those different numbers. This is how often they folded, given that the small blind also called. This is how often they 3-bet, given how the small blind also called, and this is how often they've ISO'd non-all in and ISO shoved, which we'll have both. Okay, so that's all the sort of button play, and then this is post flop for it. So here we have the button post-flop stats. So the button c-bet frequencies, flop, turn, and river, fold to check raise, delay c-bet. So delay c-bet is when they check back the flop rather than c-betting, and then bet when check 2 on the turn. We have a fold versus probe, and this is fold to a turn delay c-bet. It's in the river column just so we can label it, but it is fold to turn bet. And then we have fold to probe. So this is fold to turn probe, fold to river probe. The way probes are defined, a turn probe is when one player, the aggressor preflops, the min raiser preflop, the button, did not c-bet the flop, they check back, and then the big blind has an opportunity to probe. And then the button has an opportunity to fold to that probe, and that's a lead bet. So whenever the big blind leads on the turn, when button check behind. So this is how often the button folded to that turn probe bet, and this is how often they fold to a river probe bet. A river probe is a river lead when play was c-bet flop, check back turn, And then again, villain, the player interested in probes the river, i.e. leads the river, bets the river out of position. And then we have all these stats for limped pots. We have limp c-bet frequencies, fold to check raise, delay c-bet, fold to probe. Again, we want to separate the min-raise pots from limp pots because frequencies will often be different, and we want to try to spot that difference and not worry about how often those situations were sort of coming up. All right, and then we have the big blind, corresponding big blind stats for that situation. So we've got fold to c-bet, flop turn river, check raise, fold versus delay. Again, that's fold to turn delay. We also have donk flop and probe turn. We didn't do probe river because it takes a really long time to converge, and we sort of preferred to have donk. And then we have fold versus limp, all the same things for limp pots. Fold limp c-bet, check raise, fold delay, donk, probe. And then these are specifically separated stats as well. This is button versus small blind. This situation doesn't happen as often. That's why we don't have as many stats. We don't need as many. You're not going to get as much convergence. But this is specifically button play versus the small blind, which again is going to be different from button play versus the big blind. The small blind range is very different from a big blind calling range, and so it's important to try to, again, separate those as much as possible. So we've separated out those stats, and so we've got button versus small blind separate, just the c-bet, fold to c-bet frequencies, and again, they're not included in these stats, which is the whole idea, that they're not, all these stats are clean in that sense. And then we have three-way stats as well. Again, they're removed from these other stats. We have three-way separated, and so we have three-way just bet flop for each of the players. So for oftentimes, usually these are c-bets. So for button, it's a c-bet, but for small blind or big blind, it's a donk. And then this is fold to a c-bet or whatever kind of bet on the flop for small blind, for big blind. So fold to c-bet. And then we have limp bet just for the button, just the limp c-bet frequency. Again, just the really basics. There's not all that many post-flop three-way pots, either in limped or min-raise pots, so these stats take a long time to converge. So this is where we don't want to use up too much table space and have too many. But these very basic ones are really useful. And again, being able to see how they differ from one another is very, very useful information. All right, so that's all of the sort of, three-way stats that involve the button. And then here we have separated the situation where the button open folded. And so we have the small blind versus big blind game. So this panel is, again, pre-flop. Just starting out with small blind, we've got the big raise. It's the same setup as for button. Big raise, VPIP, min raise, fold to not all 3-bet, fold to 3-bet shove, open shove, limp, limp fold to not all in, limp fold to shove, limp raise. And then for the limp raise, of course, is you limp, they ISO, you re-raise them. For big blind, we have the corresponding stats: fold to big bet, fold to min raise, 3-bet, not all in, call open shove, fold to 4-bet, ISO, not all in, ISO shove, and lastly, fold this is ISO fold. So you ISO, they limp raise, you fold. That's an ISO fold. All right. Great. So continuing on, the post-flop stats, we have similar to just small blind versus big blind separated, just some of the most essential stats: c-bet frequencies, fold to raise, check fold, limp c-bet frequencies, fold versus raise, check fold. These are the stats that will converge, that give you a lot of information about your opponent's play in small blind versus big blind. All right, so then these are all the sort of specific stats, and then on top of this we have some general indicator type stats. So these aren't exactly statistics, but they're very useful things. So first off is just effective stacks, and effective stacks is just going to be the second shortest stack at the table, and then we also have the next. This is effective stack for the player. You can see that it's different. I'm going to talk about that in a second. So then you can also see this is next. This is the next blind level. So PT4 has issues when the blinds jump. It won't update its effective stacks. to reflect an increase in blinds for the first hand. And so this is to sort of take that into account. So you don't have to do the math. The blinds change. You can only just look at the next blind level. It's also useful just to kind of know what's coming up and not having to do the math. You know how much everyone's going to have at the next blind level. And then the last stat we have is S, and this is the symmetry, stack symmetry as I've called it. So what is this stat? So I talked a little about effective stacks. I talk a lot about effective stacks and how they work three-handed, and the concept of symmetric stacks versus asymmetric stacks, all in my Beating Spin and Go's video pack. So I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but the basic idea is that there are two effective stacks that matter at the table. There's the second shortest stack and the shortest stack. Those are the two relevant pieces of information. How much bigger the biggest stack is than the second stack doesn't matter, because there's no ICM in Spin and Go's, and you just play down to whoever's got the smaller stack. So that's what these effective stacks are. This is, whoever is the second shortest, it's going to be sort of the highest effective stacks that a player sees. But when you're the shortest stack, and there's a difference between the shortest stack and the second shortest stack, as we can see at this table, there's going to be two stacks at play. When you play against these two players, you see a stack of 375. That's how much they can put in. But when they play against you and the other player, they'll see both your stack as well as their own effective stack, the second shortest stack. And so that's this idea of symmetry versus asymmetry. If the two shortest stacks have the same stack, then stacks are considered symmetric. Everyone's playing with the same type of stack. But when one player is very short compared to the second shortest player, then there's going to be this asymmetry where one player is sort of almost playing a different game from the other two, because he's got a really short stack, but they have to play that deep stack game against each other. And so the way that this will work is that if you look at each player's stat, it'll give either the second shortest, so if they're the biggest stack or the second biggest stack, or second shortest, same thing, it'll give that as the effective stacks. It always gives the second biggest stack. And then for the short stack, it gives their sort of effective stack. But it also gives you the symmetry number. And when it's green and is 1, that's the short stack. So this just tells you that this is the short stack player, because they have a symmetry of 1. They have the same short stack as the shortest stack. And then this player you can see has a symmetry of 0.8. 0.8 is just, it's actually this player's stack divided by this player's stack. So it's the shortest stack divided by the second shortest. So it sort of shows what percent of the second biggest stack this player's stack is. So in this case, it's 80%. If he had half the chips as this player, or hero had, then it would be 0.5. In my Beating Spin and Go's pack, I look at push-fold solutions and how they change at S.5 versus S1. And so this is just a nice way, it's nice color coding. You can quickly check, is there a short stack at the table? And if so, how relevant are they? How big, how asymmetric are stacks? All right, and then we have this last panel. This is sort of just I think of it as macro indicators. These are just big picture numbers about our opponent. These are actually completely the opposite of clean stats. These aren't really stats. That's why I call them indicators. There are a bunch of situations averaged together, a bunch of similar situations averaged together to get some perspective on our opponent's overall play. And so the first one is just a very simple stat called aggression frequency. It's how often, and this is on each street, this is flop, turn, river, how often the player took an aggressive action versus a non-aggressive one. How often did they bet or raise compared to calling or folding. And you can see that, this is a great way of spotting someone aggressive because they'll have higher aggression frequencies. This is 1 after seeing flop, and this is 1 after seeing showdown. This is the percent of the time we know that player 1 after seeing the flop or 1 at showdown. These can sometimes be good indicators of how strong our opponent's range is post-flop. The stronger their range on the flop, the more we think they'll win, on the flop. It can also be an indicator of how much they bluff, or how good they are post, but it's how often they win after seeing the flop. And so generally a stronger range will, have a better hand more often, and so will win more often. So it's a good way to try to see, how wide are they flatting pre, essentially, or playing, how wide are their post-flop ranges. And then this is one after seeing showdown, so that's sort of an indicator of how strong their showdown range is. So if you have enough stats, you can start thinking that a player with a very low one at showdown is probably more likely to be a looser caller, more aggressive, bluffier. Every time you bluff and get called, you lose at showdown. Every time you make a bad call, you lose at showdown. So and then every time you make a good play, you win at every time you make a value bet and get called, you win at showdown. So this is again an indicator of how strong on average their showdown range is. And both of these stats take quite a lot to converge. They're sort of very results oriented, because obviously someone can have a very low one at showdown just because, in the sample that you saw them play, they got coolered a bunch or something. So so that's, be careful with it. But again, it can be a good indicator. And then lastly, we have total VPIP. This is just average pre-flop VPIP, how often they played a hand versus put money into the pot versus didn't. That does include weird situations like limping, where it measures checking back as not VPIPing and ISOing as VPIPing. It's a little weird, but whatever. And this is pre-flop raise, just how often they raise pre-flop in any situation, three-handed. So again, these are not clean, but the idea is that these are numbers that don't really make sense in their own right. Like, it doesn't give you any information as to what their strategy is or what their ranges look like. But this is something that you can use to compare to other players. It can be a way to spot aggressive players quicker, or tighter players quicker, or whatever. If you start, looking through a database, you can try finding some patterns behind, which types of players have which types of stats. How quickly can you spot the maniac if there's a maniac at the table? How quickly can you spot tight passive players, loose passive players, all that stuff. So this is sort of a way to try to spot that stuff quicker. And especially in spin and goes, where the populations are constantly varying because of the lobby system, where you get random players at your table, it's really important just to be able to spot new players quickly and try to figure out, overall what their tendencies are. All right, so that's all of the stat groups. That's everything. The last thing is that there are a couple of pop-ups. So let's go through the pop-ups. Let's go through the easy ones first. So there's Nash push-fold charts. So for heads up, this is really simple. This is for where we have small blind versus big blind play. Two players in the hand. So that can be either the button folded and we're playing small blind versus big blind, or there's just two people left in your three-handed tournament. Or you're playing heads up, whatever. So this will give you the solution for when the small blind can only open shove or fold, and big blind, of course, can either call or fold. What is the GTO solution when you restrict to push fold? So these are extremely useful situations. They're very useful shallow. They're very good indicators of what hands shove or call shoves well. And so they're very, very useful charts to have. And then we also have them for three-way. So these are the same charts as in my Beating Spin and Goes video pack. I discussed them a little bit more at length there. They're specifically for symmetric stacks. I talk in my video pack about how to adjust them for asymmetries and how to sort of approach adjusting to asymmetries. But these charts just give you the symmetric solutions, which generally are pretty good if you know what stacks to sort of plug in. So button is just for push fold play. Button can only push, shove, or fold. Small blind will be either the button full. So this is when the button open shoves. This is how wide we can call a shove, or if the button's short stack. This is actually how wide we can 3-bet shove. This is when the small blind's restricted to calling an open shove from button, or 3-bet shoving over an open shove from the button. And those are how wide you can get it in. And then this is big blind. This is specifically big blind versus button when the small blind folded. So button open shove, small blind folded. And this is big blind when button open shove, small blind called. How wide can big blind call? All right, so those are the simple ones. And then we have a few more specialized ones. So for any post-flop group, you can see that the basic stats only approach C bets and folds and min-raise pots, limp pots. But if you're interested in ISO pots or 3-bet pots, these don't really happen as often, and when they happen, you sort of know they're happening. And so what you can do is you can just click on any of the post-flop groups for small blind versus big blind, or big blind versus button. We don't have them for button versus small blind and three-way because you just don't get sample. But we have them for all the other ones. You just click on it and you get some simple stats for 3-bet pots, fold to C-bet, and probe. And then we have ISO pots, just fold to C-bet. Okay. And then we have, for big blind, similarly, C-bet frequencies, and fold versus probe bets. So, all right. And in this case, probe bet is the flop, so small blind checks both flop and turn. How often do they fold to the turn or call the turn? And river is they bet the flop, check the turn, how often they fold to the river probe. And similarly again for big blind, for the big blind versus button play, we've separated out big blind versus button, 3-bet pots, ISO pots, with C-bet frequencies, check fold frequencies. And then lastly, we have one more cool feature. If you click on the small blind versus big blind preflop, this will give you the versus hero stats. So these are the total frequencies, but specifically versus you. So in three-handed games, you'll sometimes have sample when you're in the button and you watch the small blind and big blind play against each other, and you'll get sample on that. But you might want to know, maybe those players are playing differently because it's against them, and maybe they play differently against you from how they play in total. So this is how you can try to check up on that when these situations come up, is you can just click on this pop-up, and it'll give you that information. With the stats filtered specifically just versus you. So now that we've covered all of the three-way stats, I want to talk about another big feature of the CoffeeSpins HUD, which is that it turns into a heads-up HUD when you get two-handed automatically. You don't need any HUD switcher, any software, anything at all. As soon as you get heads up, your HUD will display heads-up stats. Now, the CoffeeSpins HUD is intended to be mostly a three-handed HUD, and so there will be not quite as many stats as in the Coffee HUD. But here you can see an example of when we're heads up against an opponent, and what ends up happening is that the small blind versus big blind stats from three-handed, when the button open folded for preflop, end up being the heads up preflop stats for small blind, who's now the button, and big blind. And they'll be exactly the same stats in exactly the same places. All the panels will stay the same. Here they've moved just because we've changed the orientation of the table, but they'll all stay in the same place. And then the post-flop stats will be in the button section. That'll be the small blind, button is small blind, and the big blind. So you need to be careful. You don't use these small blind versus big blind stats. It jumps over to the button, big blind. And then you can see that the panels that aren't being used are all blank. These are all three-handed stats. And so, again, while it's not as comprehensive as the Coffee HUD, this will give you a way to quickly have a heads-up HUD without having a switch, without any hassle, effortlessly. And in many cases, you don't need all that many stats. If you're relatively readless, you're happy to have a pretty basic HUD and have it quickly. So in addition to the CoffeeSpins HUD, the basic CoffeeSpins HUD, every purchase will also include a copy of the CoffeeSpins Max HUD. So this is a maximized version of the Coffee HUD. We've tried to put even more info on the table to give you literally as much as possible. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this HUD, but I'm going to be using a slightly older version. There's only aesthetic differences. All the stats are the same. So I'm just going to go through this older version because it's the footage I already made. I don't want to have to redo it. All right, so we discussed the base version of the CoffeeSpins HUD. Now I want to show you the CoffeeSpins Max HUD. So this HUD is included with your purchase of the CoffeeSpins HUD, so it doesn't cost anything extra. And as the name implies, it tries to put the maximum amount of statistics on the table as possible. Now, unfortunately, this in order to do this, we had to make some compromises with labeling and presentation of the HUD. That's why it looks so different. It's just in order to maximize how many stats we can have. One of the main things that you need to know, though, is that in order for the HUD to work properly, you do need to install a custom stat. You can just download this from HUSNG.com, and once you've downloaded it, you just drag and drop it into your fonts folder if you're on Windows. And so it's easy to find the fonts folder, just search for it, or you can see it's in Control Panel, Appearances, Personalization, Fonts. Just take the downloaded file, drag and drop it, it'll automatically install. So now let's continue exploring this HUD. So let's start with Preflop. So one of the major differences is we have more stack depth groupings. We have 20 to 25, 20 plus, 16 to 20, 12 to 16, 10 to 12, and 8 to 10. So we have more groupings, which allows for more precision of reads. But you can see that they're not labeled. These stats are all the same stats as in the base version. So once you get used to the base version, all of it translates to this version. So it's a great way to learn how to use the max HUD is to start with a base one, and then you can easily transition to this one. All the color coding's the same. So once your brain's used to sort of looking for certain colors of numbers, all of that will still translate. So this is still big open size. This is fold to a big open. The top row, by the way, just like in the base HUD, is the total statistics, not divided by stack depth or anything else. So again, just as an indicator when sample size is small. But in any case, so the first one is just simply VPIP. The second one is open raise, so min raise. This is the big size. This is 3-bet, fold to 3-bet, that is, fold to 3-bet shove. This is open shove, limp, limp fold to shove, and limp shove. So again, all of this is exactly the same. Big blind will be exactly the same as in the base version. Button is exactly the same. So all of these columns correspond to the same ones in the base version. They're just not labeled to save space so that we can have more stack depth groupings. All right, post-flop, we've also been able to jam in more stats, and there's most of them are labeled, but there's a couple nuances. So we have fold versus c-bet, we have raise versus c-bet, and it's in blue to indicate that this is a raise stat. So we have fold versus delay, but we also have fold versus bet check bet. So this is a river delay c-bet. It's when the a player bets the flop, checks the turn. This is how often villain is folding if we bet the flop, check the turn, and then bet the river. Similarly, we have delay over here where it's how often villain bet the flop, check the turn, and then bet the river. So that can be a really useful stat in many situations. This is, again, bet when there's a missed c-bet, essentially. So this is on the flop, villain didn't c-bet. This is how often big blind, or sorry, we didn't c-bet. This is how often big blind bets when check to, and this is how often they bet when check to on the turn. So the small blind bet the flop, check the turn. This is how much they bet when check to, and this is similarly the same stat for rivers. Next we have just fold versus limp c-bet, standard. This is raise versus c-bet. It's just R rather than R over CB to save space. And then this is bet the flop in a limp pot. So that's how often they donk the flop in a limped pot. Then in the small blind stats, again, we have c-bet, we have fold versus check versus a raise. It's not check raise. Again, we have delay c-bet. Again, bet check bet delay c-bet, and check fold to these probes, to these float bets or whatever they're called, the stabs when player missed their c-bet opportunity. And then we have limp c-bet, fold versus check raise, and check fold. And then we have, of course, just the same button versus small blind stats. Again, this situation doesn't happen very often because small blind frequencies are pretty low, especially flatting ones, and especially situations where the big blind didn't flat behind. So these are just very basic c-bet stat and fold versus c-bet. So this is c-bet, this is fold versus c-bet. So this is for the button, this is for the small blind. And similarly, three-way is also the same. There's just c-bet flop or donk flop, as it might be, and there's same thing for limped pots. This is just the same stats: c-bet, donk, donk. For the button, we have c-bet, flop, turn, river. We have fold versus check raise on flop and turn. River is pretty much a useless stat because you get almost no sample size on it ever. So I've just removed it to avoid people getting confused if they see 100 or 0 and acting based on that, because this stat will almost never converge. We again have delay c-bet, bet, check, bet, fold versus probe, fold versus river probe, pretty straightforward. And then just as a note, river probe is defined as the button c-bet the flop, c-bet the turn. The button c-bet the flop did not c-bet the turn. A probe is when the big blind then bets the river after the button missed his turn c-bet opportunity. And obviously folding versus probe is the same thing. It's how often they bet the flop, check the turn, and then fold to a river probe. And then we have just limp c-bet frequencies, fold versus probe, pretty straightforward. The big blind, we've tried to add an extra stat, so it's a little bit more complicated. So donk is straightforward. This is flop, turn, river, donk. Fold to c-bet is straightforward. But here you can see that there's a random blue stat. And this is a fold versus, it's labeled as fold versus delay, but this is a flop stat. And it's actually fold versus, this is check raise frequency. So in order to cram in more stats, we've put in the check raise frequency next to fold versus delay, but it's actually check raise. And that's why it's in this blue color, to differentiate it from the other stats and make it look the same as other check raise stats and raise stats. You can see it's the same color as this raise, This is a raise stat. And but then this is fold versus delay on the turn, fold versus the bet, check, bet. And then here we have probe, and again, there's a little stat sticking out. Again, it's in yellow because the donk stat. This is actually a donk in a limped pot. So this is the one stat, most of the limp pot stats are below the line, but this one we just wanted to sneak in. And again, it's in yellow to make it look the same as other donk stats. But this is donk the flop in a limped pot. Obviously, you can't probe the flops, so that's sort of the idea. Like otherwise, there'd be a blank space. So we put in another stat to maximize the stats. And then this is just probe turn, probe river. This is fold versus limp c-bets. And again, we have another different color. This is blue. This is check raise and a limped pot on the flop. So these two blue stats correspond to check raise. This is for limp pots. This is for min raise pots. They're not labeled, but the color coding is meant to indicate that they're different. And again, you can't have a probe on the flop. So that's sort of the idea. And then, of course, we have probe turn, probe river. Those are just normal stats. So that's the concept behind the CoffeeSpins max HUD, is that we've maximized the amount of stats we can have on the table by dropping some of the pretty borders and some of the labels just to provide more stats. This is again just the same thing as well as the base version. There's aggression frequencies. There's one while seeing showdown, while seeing the flop, one while seeing showdown, VPIP, preflop raise, number of hands. The Nash push-fold charts are exactly the same. Everything is otherwise pretty much exactly the same. So all of these work the same way. Similarly, the pop-ups are still exactly the same as well. If we click on the small blind versus big blind, we get the versus hero stats. And if we click on the post-flop stat groups for button and big blind, small blind, big blind, button, big blind, we get 3-bet pots and ISO pots. So, so in that sense, again, the CoffeeSpins Max is meant to be almost exactly the same as the base, but we've just added more stats to it at the expense of some labeling. But again, if you practice with the CoffeeSpins base version and you just want more stats, it should be pretty easy to transition to this bigger version once you're sort of comfortable and you feel like you want even more stats, which I certainly always want even more stats. So just like the base version of the CoffeeSpins HUD, the CoffeeSpins Max HUD does convert to a heads-up HUD when reached two-handed. Again, the small blind and big blind preflop stats from three-handed when the button folds turn into the heads-up preflop stats, and the post-flop button versus big blind stats turn into heads-up post-flop stats. And it's nice, the heads-up version inherits all of the same stats of the three-way max version, and so you do end up with an even more robust heads-up HUD when you use the CoffeeSpins Max HUD, because you get extra post-flop stats and more stack depth groupings pre-flop. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough of the CoffeeSpins HUD and the CoffeeSpins Max HUD. Again, it's available exclusively through HUSNG.com. Wish you guys all best of luck. I hope that you all spin very big multipliers, and cheers.